Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I cannot get out of my mind Julie Louis-Dreyfus's Emmy acceptance speech this year when she won an award for Veep. And she talked about a show that started off as political satire and turned into a sobering documentary. We are going to talk about the election. You know, ADL is a nonpartisan organization. We're not involved in election campaign activity. You might have heard me say that a few times. And we don't support or oppose candidates, but our issues have a way of creeping into the campaign debate. And this year, as much as ever, our research, our analysis has been sought after, and it's been cited by media outlets all over the world. This year, we saw something a little bit different, which is that there was a big story in like the third day of the transition. That was a little bit unprecedented. But all of us in the room are really trying to understand what this election tells us, what it means for our organization and for our country, and what it tells us about the conditions, the political conditions in both parties. So we have three very astute and humorous and smart observers with different perspectives who are going to share with us today their takeaways of the election. And we'll hear a little bit about what they may be reading into the tea leaves of the transition, rumors, and some announcements now we have. So Josh Marshall, all the way on the right, that's not a political characterization. Josh is an award-winning journalist, and he's a founder and editor of one of America's most important liberal political news websites. It's called Talking Points Memo. If you don't look at it already, you really should. Bethany Mandel, to Josh's left, again, not a political distinction, is a senior contributor at the Federalist, and she writes for a lot of conservative culture blogs, and we're going to talk about how we all need to be reading some different perspectives. Jeff Pollock, sitting to my right, I'm not going to comment on that as a political distinction. So Jeff was the pollster for the pro-Hillary Clinton super PAC called Priorities USA.
Great job, I did.
Well, when I first planned to introduce Jeff, I was going to talk about how he was selected to be Pollster of the Year in 2015 by the American Association of Political Consultants, but I wasn't sure it's a compliment anymore, so I'm going to hold back on that. Mm-hmm. And panelists, let me introduce to you our audience. These are the leaders of ADL from all over the country, and they're no armchair observers. These are the people who help us shape an agenda, and we are all together digging in and looking for opportunities for our organization in this political environment. The stakes of our success are really high, not for our organization only, but for our country. So we'll be listening closely. I'll pose some opening questions, friends, and then I would ask you to be quite active on the app if you have a question. Tap the submit a question, and I will be looking at your questions while we're sitting up here so I can integrate as many things that you want to ask while we're speaking. So take out your phones. We won't think it's rude. So we are still digesting a surprise. Josh marked his own psychological progress last week when he said, "It no longer feels like shoving broken glass in my ears when I hear the words President-elect Trump." So he's moving on.
There you go.
But I think I want to take this opportunity of having our pollster in kind of the belly of the beast, and I want to start by asking Jeff, what might we have missed?
Well, a lot. And thank you to the ADL for having all of us to speak. The election results were certainly a surprise to everybody, and that is universal, from all of our colleagues on the right to those of us on the left. The presidential election was a supreme shock. And there is a lot of discussion going on. The day after the election, I was scheduled to give a speech at ABNY, which is an organization here in New York, where I was asked that question, what happened? And I said, F if I know. And it was not the most artful answer, but it was a truthful answer. And I think in the subsequent days, we've been able to look at a lot of stuff. And as a pollster, we're certainly on the line. It's an unusual business. It's one of the few businesses that I know of where we're held accountable for predicting the future. And of course, that's very hard for us to do, but we are frequently held accountable for that. And many of my colleagues right now in the polling industry are obfuscating the results by going on and saying, well, the undecideds broke his way, that's true. There are late deciders who broke his way, that's true. The Comey thing happened, that stopped momentum, that's true. There are probably white non-college voters that we are not speaking to enough in terms of polling. That's probably true. All of these things are factors in contributing to why the industry was wrong. And the notion that we were right within the margin of error, scientifically, yes, we were within the margin of error. But when you're looking at all the websites that all of you looked at, I'm sure the 538s and the Upshot, et cetera, that all told you that she basically had an 80% plus chance of winning, it's hard to claim that we got it right within the margin of error. And so I think there's a lot of reflecting going on. Now that doesn't mean that public opinion is sort of dead. I had a lot of races the other day where I did win. We won a great congressional race, for example, in North Jersey for a nice new member of Congress, Josh Gottheimer, who beat who I think is a very bad guy in New Jersey. And the polling was dead on there. And the polling I did in West Virginia for the new governor was dead on. And the polling for the governor of Montana was on. So the polling doesn't seem to be in crisis, but there's definitely a problem. And what happened, it seems that a lot of these things sort of broke and contributed to a President Trump.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for letting me insult your profession.
No problem.
A little bit.
My
Bethany,
mother's not here. She'll come.
Okay.
She'll do it later. Don't worry.
So Bethany, you saw this victory coming a little sooner than most people, and so you've had a little more time to acclimate. You might have been doing a little bit better last week than Josh over here with the broken glass. But I want to hear your take on what we think we can be looking for, what you're hearing out of the transition, rumors, announcements, and I know you talked to me about there are things that still keep you up at night.
Yeah, so we this morning got a couple of reports of the first sort of confirmed people that are going to be named, and I don't think it's particularly good news. Flynn is probably the most worrisome, and Sessions isn't the best choice either. But the thing that worries me most is what I'm hearing is from folks on the right, like myself, who were not in favor of Trump, are being told by the transition team, like, if you start it, I'll do it. Like, go F yourself. Like, you didn't support us. We want nothing to do with you. And I sort of understand it. The Trump folks had to not only fight against the left, they had to fight against Hillary, but they also had to fight against a large portion of the Republican Party. And so they're pretty vindictive. And the thing that concerns me the most is sort of the possibility of Rudy getting picked for Secretary of State, which I don't mind Rudy Giuliani, but I don't think he's an appropriate choice for Secretary of State given his foreign ties. But the thing that concerns me is they have thousands of positions that they need to fill, and they don't have the people to fill them. If you're not willing to bring on Republicans who said anything bad about Donald Trump, you have a very small pool of people to pick from, and it's not the best of the best. And that's the thing that really concerns me the most, is that Donald Trump is what he is, and that's the choice that America made. But who is he going to surround himself with? And the things that I'm seeing about the people that he has chosen and has a pool of people to choose from worries me greatly.
Thank you. Sobering. Josh, I want to ask you sort of the same thing, but also looking at what the opposition can look like. You've been following very, very closely this issue of the repeal of Medicare, what Paul Ryan's going to do. So feel free to offer any advice you would have to the Democrats, but give us your sort of view of the state of play.
Well, in a lot of ways, I agree with what Bethany said. I mean, there is, every appointment we have seen to date has, I would say, been very troubling, either because of who the person is themselves or because of the position that they are being put in. Reince Priebus is sort of the exception, and he's the exception because he's just not, he doesn't have a history of being a racist or anti-Semite, which is a really low standard at this point but you know, it sounds funny, but that's where we are. I think, you know, what is really troubling, I think Donald Trump has very few settled views. I think he has some basic instincts. I think he thinks in terms of very much in us against them thinking. You can see that domestically, you see that internationally. He thinks in terms of zero-sum relationships. Again, you see that domestically, you see that internationally. He has, I think he sees a lot of problems with what a lot of us see as 21st century America and embrace as 21st century America. So that makes it even more worrisome. That somewhat blank slate effect makes it even more worrisome when he puts someone like General Flynn as his national security advisor. Because on the one hand, what a national security advisor is supposed to do is coordinate and bring together what everybody in the national security apparatus is thinking, whether that's the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the intelligence community. On the other hand, it's the person who talks to the president every day. And when you have a person who is, I think, highly impressionable, you hear this from his allies as well as his opponents, that he tends to repeat the last thing he was told. But someone who thinks in terms of retribution, in terms of friends and enemies and only friends and enemies, loyalists and enemies. In those terms, it's very troubling having someone like that be the person he talks to every day. The Secretary of State works in a different part of town. The Secretary of Defense works in a different state, right? So I think what we're seeing is very troubling, and I think for the concerns of this organization, everybody needs to come back to the realization that people who are xenophobes, people who are, whether you want to call them racists or people who don't really like people who don't look like them, those people tend to bring anti-Semites around them, even if they are not anti-Semites themselves. And that's just the truth, and that's where we are.
So that's an important distinction, and it's one that really occupies ADL. We speak very accurately and with a lot of precision about what distinguishes someone who we might call an anti-Semite to someone who facilitates it or associates with it or is a delivery system for it. So I want to ask for some quick takes on the Bannon hire. We had a take on it that you probably saw. So in the context of your remarks, I want whichever one of you, starting with Josh, wanted to just say a word.
You know, I think there's a very interesting thing everybody should read. It's BuzzFeed a few days ago published a Q&A he did at a Vatican conference, 2014 or something like that, Steve Bannon. It's really worth Googling it, looking it up, and reading it, because what you will find is that Steve Bannon is not a Yahoo. He's a fairly sophisticated person. Right. And I think what he really is someone who, what you will read is something that is very much like the European, usually Catholic far right in Europe. Now I'm not talking about Catholicism, but the part of the European far right that tends to be among Catholics. Very much white European civilization that needs to be grounded in Christianity and that is threatened by international finance that is not rooted in white Europeans and Christianity. And I think that there's information from Bannon's, one of his divorce cases, that has him making an anti-Semitic comment. You never know what comes up in a
Right.
divorce case. But that is, and I think when you look at how he ran Breitbart, and even what he says explicitly, that he sees racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism as something that kind of inevitably comes along when you are building a right populist movement that aspires to the goals that I just set out. So I don't really have a sense whether Steve Bannon personally has animus towards Jews, but to me it doesn't really matter. If you see the kind of worldview I describe is one that has a deep and probably inherent gravitation towards anti-Semitism. And if you see anti-Semitism as something that you need to harness for other goals, I don't see what the distinction is, or I don't see why it matters whether you are personally anti-Semitic.
Thank you. So Bethany had a name for the year 2016 that really rolls off the tongue. She called it the year the media and a good number of liberals discovered the continued existence of anti-Semitism and began to decry it loudly. It's a long name for this year, but with that in mind, did you want to maybe add to that or give your take on Bannon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that troubles me most about the Bannon choice is that it wasn't talked about when he was named to the campaign. I think that was the point where there should have been an outcry, and there wasn't. We knew everything that we know now then, and I think that it would have made a lot more sense to be outraged then. I agree with almost everything that you said, especially the BuzzFeed article. I think that's worth a read. The thing that troubles me about Bannon isn't necessarily that he may or may not be anti-Semitic, and I think that the hyperbole from the media about him being a white nationalist is dangerous. And I think that the media has played into Donald Trump's traps every single turn. And when we hyperventilate over every single thing and go too far, I mean, there's no proof that he's a white supremacist or that he's an anti-Semite. But when we just come out of the gate screaming that, it takes away our legitimacy from real, possible, very troubling appointments that can come later. So I think that we as a media and as a society need to sort of step back and take a deep breath and assess every situation for what it really is. But the thing that troubles me most about Bannon isn't necessarily the racism, the anti-Semitism, all of these things that percolated on Breitbart, was that he was comfortable monetizing all of that, whether he believed it or not. I think that all of us in this room, if you were sitting in an office and someone said, if you're at a marketing agency and they said, this Nazi logo would go really well on this shirt, and I think it would sell really well in this corner of this country, and I think everyone in this room would say, like, I'm out. And that's not something that Stephen Bannon was willing to do, because he prioritized power and money and all those things over being a moral person. And when you have the ear of the president, you don't want someone who's completely immoral and has a thirst for power and money above basic human decency. So that to me is the most troubling thing about Stephen Bannon.
Thank you. So I want to aggregate a couple clusters of questions. A few people are asking about what signals might there be from the president-elect or from the transition, like the rumor of the Romney meeting, that there'll be that President-elect Trump is trying to broaden his appeal. And a few people asked, just realistically, how realistic is it to think that the Trump presidency will include some inclusive voices? Some people ask about Democrats and Republicans together, but it's a really important question for us and one we're thinking about.
I think it's too early to say, but everything that I'm hearing just from, I mean, there's been a lot of conversations sort of on right of center national security listservs that I'm on about, you know, would you serve in a Trump administration? Are you willing to do so, given how outspoken a lot of folks were? And everything that they're hearing from the Trump folks, it's not even a question of would you serve or would you not serve, it's we don't want you to serve. So if they're not willing to sort of hear those voices, then I don't anticipate him hearing left of center voices if he doesn't want to hear right of center voices. But to Josh's point, he's not an ideologue. I think that's the biggest wild card with the Donald Trump presidency, is that it could just change on the wind. I mean, if it were Mitt Romney that were elected, you'd know the agenda now, and you'd know the agenda 3 months ago. And we don't know the agenda, and that I think is the scariest thing about.
If I can add one thing,
Yeah.
I think beyond the charged issues that we're thinking most about, there are basic, big policy. I mean, we think about there's unified Republican government, but there are really big issues like trade, some foreign policy issues that I don't think can be papered over. Now, there's no one side of the trade debate or other isn't evil, but I mean, so it's different in that sense, but that figures in a huge amount of instability in coalitional terms of what happens, right? I even think on Medicare and Social Security or Obamacare, it's really not clear what Donald Trump thinks. And, you know, to go back to your point, if you had, I mean, think back to under George W. Bush, when there was this big push to privatize Social Security, it was very clear where he stood. That's what he believed. He was going to push it as hard as he could, even when it got hot. So you have a lot of issues that I could imagine public opinion turns against, and Trump's like, no way, I'm out.
He's so poll obsessed.
Yeah, so that doesn't really speak specifically to the issues that we're the core issues we're talking about today, but it just builds such, we just don't know what's going to happen, and if you end up with President Trump, you know, totally at odds with the leaders of his party in Congress, I don't think we have any idea where that leads.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a possibility given their opposition to him.
But look, they're floating the Romney thing and the Nikki Haley thing. They're not more than floating. These are meetings, some of them that are happening. So some of those people are going to get appointed because they have to, because there's no way to fill the slots with just people who are for Trump. It's not humanly possible.
Watch them.
They can't. Like, it's just there aren't enough people. So at some point,
certainly
also,
at the second and third layer. I mean,
Right,
there are
right,
literally
yeah.
not enough people.
Certainly not enough people. And then when you think about, and there'll be a conservative Democrat that gets appointed to some cabinet position. I'm sure of it. I don't know who, I don't know what, but I'm sure that they'll find a conservative Democrat as well. You know, there are conservative Democrats in southern and western states where Donald Trump did very well, and so, you know, it's not politically even dangerous for some of those folks. So I assume that that's going to happen. What does that mean as it relates to going forward? Who knows? I mean, this is such a complicated thing. Let's be clear. This is a president-elect who wants a massive infrastructure spending. Massive. We're talking about $1 trillion infrastructure spending that the Republican president wants. And he's supposed to pass this with a Republican House that has done nothing but crap all over a president who did the exact same thing. And so I don't even know how you pull that deal off. That is a remarkable thing to try to walk in and say your number one accomplishment is essentially something that's an anathema to the Republicans in the House. And so sure, is there some sort of way to put together infrastructure spending plus killing Obamacare plus massive tax reform? That is complicated. And when I think about what this guy can pull off quickly, complicated ain't it?
If I could add one thing
Yes.
to something Bethany said. So far, as of this morning, all of the appointees that we have seen, appointees or nominees, are people who either are entirely in sync
Yeah.
with the kind of xenophobic campaign that Donald Trump ran, or people who have more amorphous or middle-of-the-road politics, but who surrendered all dignity to be total loyalists to Donald Trump during the campaign.
I can't believe you'd say that about Rudy. That's terrible.
Well, I mean, some of them are twofers, right? Some of them manage both.
Yes.
But no, think about, I will give this, I mean, Reince Priebus, when people were openly talking about Trump needing to leave the ticket in early October, was 100% behind him. That's why he's chief of staff. But that kind of, the only people who are, as of now, who are, and there's tons of positions still to be filled, the only people who are getting appointments who are in any sense out of sync with the campaign that Donald Trump ran are people who have shown that they will be 100% loyal under any circumstances.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think that Romney or Nikki Haley will.
Oh, I don't think they'll do it. I don't think those particular will do it. I think there will be people like them, is what I meant, but not them. Mitt Romney, no way.
He's got a nice house in Utah.
Indeed.
Thank you. So I want to do kind of a lightning round. So there are a rich number of ADL issues that we're going to be dealing with right in the aftermath of this election. The xenophobia, sort of trying to bring people together, looking at vulnerable communities. But the same way we fight for equality for people in our communities, we have a country that gets a little bit bullied in the international community, and fair treatment for Israel is a top priority for this organization. And a key part of supporting Israel against some of the bullies in the neighborhood is the relationship with the United States. So what do you think we can expect from this new administration?
I mean, I think the biggest problem is you don't know what to expect. I think that's just the issue. I'm interested to see who he appoints ambassador. I think that'll be an indication of where he's going. My biggest concern, if I were...
Can I just ask, the Mike Huckabee rumor from last night?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know what's true and what's not true.
Sorry, Governor Huckabee was last night's rumor.
Yeah, I sort of, it's been so up and down, I'm like, I don't even want it. Until there's a real name on the table, it's not even worth it. But the thing that worries me if I was a one-issue voter on Israel was Hillary sort of she knows what she's doing. She's been Secretary of State. She watched her husband go through everything with Arafat in the Second Intifada. But the thing that worries me, I mean, this is like sort of an overarching theme, the thing that worries me most about Donald Trump is that he doesn't understand that he doesn't understand the region, he doesn't understand the issues, and Israel is the canary in the coal mine, is the center of the tinderbox of the world. So my biggest hope is that he chooses good people for foreign policy, because if he doesn't, it's Israel on the front lines.
So far, not so good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll be watching that. And then, this is an organization that for 103 years, we've been doing our work by also looking to the strength of the democratic institutions in our country. A lot of people, some people are still looking at the popular vote.
Yep.
So can you help put in context the discrepancy that we saw with the popular vote? Is it huge? Is it?
Yeah, it's 1.5 million votes and growing.
And what percent? How many points?
Well, so that's the one place. Obviously, when you look at the polls, she'll win by somewhere about 2-ish%, maybe 3 at the end of the day, but it's somewhere in that range. That's where the polls will have actually been fine. If it were up to me, though, we would ban all national polls because they're useless.
Yeah.
And when you look at the state polls, that's where the numbers were more off, and where, when I talked in the beginning, where the stuff that I'm paying attention to. There's nobody who would have predicted Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin to have gone the other way. Yes, Florida we always knew was a toss-up, but these other series of states, particularly in the Rust Belt, not so. It's very hard. The Republicans are the ones who have been the most anti-electoral college, and yet they have benefited the most from it in the last 20 years for sure. There'll be movements to abolish it. They won't go anywhere. But there certainly is a discussion to have. More to the point, though, this is why we've got electoral problems up and down because of gerrymandering and because of partisan primaries that have pushed our candidates to both sides in a bad way. And we have voter participation going down in all these places because of that. And we have the notion that the Republicans, for me to be partisan for one brief moment, the notion that any party would have lobbied to reduce voting hours in a place like North Carolina, that should outrage all of us.
Yeah, and that did outrage me.
That is outrageous.
Yeah.
That is outrageous. Right? And I'm for expanded hours in Utah just as much, just so we're clear. I don't care, right? It should be easier for people to vote, not harder, in all sorts of ways. And so, yes, she'll win the popular vote, and that does mean that Donald Trump's got to pay attention to the country. The fact that he has no center in terms of policy makes that easier for him, right? We don't know it, so it is easier for him to sort of have policies that are sort of shifting and pay attention to both sides. Getting it through Congress, that's a whole different story.
So we're winding down into the last couple of minutes. We have a lot of people looking and asking for opportunities for our organization. And a few people want to ask you, Bethany, our mission should enfranchise a big tent of people, movement conservatives, liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call it. If any of the three of you would like to give just an impression about where are the opportunities for a group like ADL and the mission that drives us. Josh, you open your mouth.
I think, well, what I think is this is a unique historical moment in the sense that you can see very clearly, you see very palpably that discrimination of all sorts needs democratic institutions and democratic norms to break down. And we are now seeing this happening to all sorts of different groups, or maybe about to happen to all sorts of different groups in this country. So there are a lot of people to make common cause with. And some of that common cause is across, ideological spectrum where there's not a lot of common thinking. But I think on every front, this organization needs to be thinking of, again, civil liberties, democratic norms, and not allowing what is abnormal to become normal because abnormal is holding power in a certain part of our government.
Potent words, thank you.
I can speak to sort of the more conservative take and view on the ADL, which has largely been that it targets one side instead of another. And I think, along with the Bannon outrage and statement, I'm very concerned about the leftward turn of the Democratic Party. My husband, Seth Mandel, wrote a wonderful column for the New York Post. He's the op-ed editor there a couple days ago about sort of how, when Hillary, who's sort of a more centrist Democrat, was vanquished, there's definitely the possibility for a more far-left wing of the Democratic Party, a la Bernie Sanders and the folks who were burning Israeli flags outside the DNC, to capture power. And I think that we're seeing that with Keith Ellison. And I think that we need to be concerned about the anti-Israel populism possibility springing up on the left as well. I view the sort of rise of Donald Trump similarly to the rise of Bernie Sanders. He was a very different politician, and he spoke to populist voters, and I was surprised in my personal life. I mean, this is anecdotal, but so take it as it is, but how many folks that I knew of my generation who were supporting Bernie Sanders, and when it turned into Hillary Clinton, they ended up voting for Donald Trump. So, I mean, I think that we need to sort of call it out on every side, and I hope that the ADL does so.
I agree.
Yeah,
I do. The notion of the New York Post standing on sort of what the future of the Democratic Party should be is kind of humorous, let's be clear. The Democratic Party will sort itself out, just as the Republican Party needs to sort itself out. A couple of thousand votes here and there, and we'd be talking about the destruction of the Republican Party and what Donald Trump brought. What we have is a divided America. And what an organization like the ADL and what you can all do and what we have to do, and you heard Jonathan say it before, you heard your leadership say it, you've heard others. If I do a bad job quoting Hillel or Heschel, so I'm not going to do it well, but we know the words from both, and it's when there's mass deportations that start to happen, it's our job to stand up and get in front of them and make sure they don't happen, because that's wrong. When there's anti-Semitism, it's our job to get up and stand up. And if there's any notions of registries of any sort of human being, it's our job to stand up and register ourselves. So, you know, that's where this organization and the people in here, none of whom we can see thanks to these lights, can stand and be a sort of force for good. And all of us have a job to hold this president and any other president accountable for what they're going to do.
I have to say one thing about Keith Ellison. That is not a fair or accurate thing you're saying about him.
It isn't.
I know this person. I think it would be well to look at his relationship with the Jewish community in his district, which is very good. The fact that someone is a strong advocate of two states for Israel and the Palestinians does not mean, and I don't think this is what you're saying, does not mean that they are anti-Semite, and it does not mean that they are part of an illiberal trend in American politics. That's just not accurate. I know this person, I know the people who know him. People say the same thing about Steve Bannon, but Keith Ellison does not run a racist and anti-Semitic website. They're not the same. And I think we need to be very rigorous with ourselves, not imputing hostility to Jews or to any other group of people, because people have different, and I would say, and I say this as a Jew and a Zionist, very reasonable views about the situation in Israel-Palestine. I'll leave it at that.
So you can applaud, Josh. Welcome to morning coffee in our office in DC. So these are very much the debates we're having. I'll say, in terms of whether it's Steve Bannon or Keith Ellison, the country may be polarized, and that polarization makes our work hard. Mm-hmm. We have a Center on Extremism, and every day we issue a report or a blog. I have different partners and stakeholders who call me to say, thank you for calling out the right-wing white guys. Thank you for calling out the jihadists. Mm-hmm. Some people are happy on one day, not happy on another, but we are committed to calling it like we see it. We strive for consistency, and it doesn't always mean you equate a Democrat and a Republican. With respect to Congressman Ellison, we do know him. He's had a hearing and a briefing on anti-Semitism and among Muslims, and he's really done a lot of interesting and important work on civil rights. We have different perspectives than he does on some Middle East policy issues. He does vote in support of Israel, but we have different perspectives, and we're in these relationships to advocate for our views. We don't sit across from the table from any politician and say, we're your guy, we're your yes guy. We are partisans of our mission, and so we are engaged with Mr. Ellison's office all these years about different things that he writes or says, or and sometimes it's to thank him, and sometimes it's to air a difference. So you can't see the audience. You watch I assume you all three watch the show Scandal.
We do, yeah. Well, I do. I can't
So
speak.
you have to.
Josh is more erudite than that.
Yeah, I don't.
Speak for him.
These are gladiators in
They
the
are.
audience. Gladiators for justice.
Yeah, good.
And so
I'm Olivia Pope.
I can promise to all of you that we're going to continue to call it like we see it. take in all of your words about how to include more people in our work and take in different perspectives. We're going to work with this president, and we're going to stand with him when he fulfills his pledges, and we'll call him out when he doesn't. So it's going to be interesting, and thank you so much
Thank you.
for making time for us.